Yeah, let's take that.
Is it broken or did I just sit on it there?
I think that
Let's not take the chance.
it's broken.
Yeah.
That's what happened. Yikes, the wrist. Well, my wrist is already broken, so we can't do more damage to this wrist. Okay, I'm sorry, guys.
No. Sorry. Or we were not up to it. Our chairs. This is the penultimate event for our center. There is one at, the last one is at 4 o'clock up in the McKinney room on the Hazara persecution and resistance in Afghanistan. But this one is a book Adda. And those who are not exposed to South Asia, and Adda essentially means a site for collective deliberation and exchange. We do, at the Saxena Center, we do 2 or 3 book Addas per semester, and this is our last one. The topic is, we're discussing this book, The Difficult Politics of Peace, Rivalry in Modern South Asia, by Christopher Clary. I will introduce him in a moment. The book, 2 things about this book ought to be noted. First, surprising as it may seem, this is the first book that studies decision-making on foreign policy on both sides of the border. We have studies of Indian decision-making on Pakistan. We have studies of Pakistani decision-making on India. But this is the first book which studies decision-making elites on both sides. That ought to be noted first. I was surprised, but it turns out to be true. Second, the book proposes a new theory, leader primacy theory. Let me cite what that theory entails. The theory posits that strategic incentives are mediated by the presence or absence of a leader's concentrated authority over foreign policy within a rival state. Only when a leader has consolidated his or her authority can a state act in a manner consistent with those strategic incentives. This hardly means that leaders with the concentrated authority of their states produce peaceful outcomes in rivalries as an automatic byproduct. It takes 2 to tango, after all, and as we've seen over the last many decades, one leader in control of his or her society's politics often contends with a leader without such control, unquote. So, unless leaders of both rival states have concentrated authority and not robust counter-elites trying to challenge them, peace is unlikely to obtain. Peace is unlikely to obtain. That's the theory. And it also says that peace can obtain when these conditions are satisfied. It's not an unending conflict, that is to say. Chris Clary is an assistant professor of political science at the State University of New York, Albany. That's how I used to know it. I think the name has changed. It's become University of Albany.
I think we use at Albany.
University at Albany, yeah. So we always called it SUNY Albany. So and this is a very heavily reformulated version of his PhD dissertation at MIT, and he's been teaching at SUNY at Albany since roughly since then. No, he's been a doctoral fellow at the Watson Institute here, and that has to be after the PhD is completed. And before that, he was a predoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard, a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation, and also served before coming to MIT for his PhD as country director for South Asian affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Pentagon, and was also a research associate at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in California. So the format is as follows. I will introduce the three commentators later. The author of the book, Chris Clary, will speak for about 25 minutes, and then each commentator will have 12 to 15 minutes for their assessment of this new book's argument. The book was published some months ago in the series that I did at Oxford University Press, New York. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Ashu, and thank you for those that are here and those that are watching wherever out in the world. I wanted to start actually by thanking Oxford University Press, which I had a great time going through the editorial process, in part with Ashu's Modern South Asia series there. I won't try to encapsulate this whole book in 25 minutes, but I will try to give you an introduction for those of you that haven't had a chance to read it. And I hope encourage you to read it. It's available widely, including a cheaper edition in India, thanks to OUP, and then hopefully soon a cheaper edition in Pakistan as well. So the book is motivated by three questions, looking at cooperation and conflict within, between rival states, what explains crisis escalation and de-escalation for those states, and then is kind of the background condition, the puzzle that I'm confronting is why is peace, despite its abundant benefits, so elusive for states, even though we have on the record leaders in India and Pakistan saying since 1947 that peace would be better than the situation they're dealing with. It's not like they haven't considered that possibility, and so I want to try to grapple with that in the book. And there's a long political science literature on rivalry, which this is sort of responding into, but in particular, the book tries to take advantage of the fact that underneath this thing that we call the India-Pakistan rivalry, there are a lot of ups and downs in the relationship that we can draw on to try to explain, and I want to use that heterogeneity to my advantage rather than just say it's always bad. Because it has been better, and at parts in the relationship, you could see maybe the rivalry even ending. And in addition to it having been better than some periods than others, it's also varied across domains. So there's a good book, Gabriella Bloom, where she talks about these islands of agreement that exist within rivalries, and where they can make progress on functional areas in sometimes profound ways. And that allows them to keep animosity at bay for a while. So in the book, I sort of propose, that there's a set of conditions that rivalries are moving back and forth across. And so we have a periods of time when we have stable rivalry. It's just ugly, but it manages to move forward. But then there are episodes of hope and conciliatory initiatives, and sometimes those progress in a meaningful, substantive way, and then we get to something that we might call a peace process. And then many times that collapses, and it might collapse all the way down to crisis and war. And other times you can move from stable rivalry into crisis and war. And so I want to use that movement to the left and to the right and try to see what explains that. And as Professor Varshney mentioned, what I propose in the book is what explains it is this mix of the external environment, which is of such interest to international relations scholars over the years, that produces a set of strategic incentives, a mix of the resources that states have to deal with strategic problems, as well as the severity of those problems. And then that's mediated by the control that leaders have internally within their states. And, leaders are of different skill, they're in different institutional contexts, and they're contending with leaders of different skills internally. So I spend a lot of time in the book, as Professor Varshney mentioned, thinking about these intra-elite fights, which I think help determine a lot of foreign policy activity overseas. And in particular, even when the incentives are blaringly obvious that peace would be better, when there is fractured authority within, the elites can't respond to those incentives in a rational, productive way. And sometimes the nature of domestic politics is so toxic that it produces the exact opposite outcomes that you would expect from the external circumstances alone. And one thing I think one argument I'm going to make, which is going to be a little controversial, is the presence of all these veto players, these rival centers of power domestically, is not just doesn't just gum up the works. It actually has an escalatory bias, because typically it's easier for states to start problems overseas. You need less permission internally to cause trouble externally than you do to actually make peace. And you can think in the US case, if the US wanted to settle problems with Iran, that would be very difficult. But if the US president wanted to bomb Iran tonight, he could do it without a problem, right? And that is true in many contexts. And in a lot of places, the military, the intelligence agencies can use violence without the authority of even the civilians, right? So if you think about who can cause problems versus who can create solutions, that is what's generating this escalatory bias in fractured situations. And so that's going to take us beyond strategic incentives, be interested in foreign policy authority domestically. And in addition to that, another feature I want to mention is when there is fractured authority, leaders are both scared internally. They look around, they see hawks in their midst. Those hawks often come from intelligence agencies or militaries have access to the tools of violence. And they are worried for their political future. And even when their preferences might be peaceful, they will self-censor and avoid taking steps until they consolidate power, right? So we can see people that have peaceful preferences that wait until the domestic situation is better before they act. And even when they try, for those leaders that decide to blow past those circumstances, they face stalling from below. The bureaucracies do not move quickly. They are sometimes insubordinate in executing leader behavior. You can see that also, a case I won't talk about much today, but I.K. Gujral, in India when he was foreign minister, the Foreign Service thought he was kind of an idealist. They didn't really need to listen to him. They thought he'd be a transitory president, so they just didn't kind of follow his commands very aggressively, and they waited him out. And then in cases, which the book focuses on, they can face sabotage as well, right? Spoiling behavior. Intelligence agencies might look the other way if there's aggressive operations overseas. Military adventures could happen. So the book details a number of mechanisms I won't all go through, but there's this reason this bias is present. And then I'm going to test that argument that I just laid out by looking at the variation we see across the 75-year sweep of the rivalry, the ups and downs, up to the present. And what I'm going to argue is it's not so much that I want to see that congruence when there's strong strategic incentives favoring certain things and concentrated authority. I want to see peacemaking activity. But I also want that congruence to be for the right reasons, that I have that when the incentives are the same, but the number of veto players change, I should see changes in outcomes. And I should also see a lot of, what an old professor of mine, Stephen Bennyberg, used to call speech evidence. I should see the participants talking about why did the behavior change? It's because the circumstances, especially those domestic political circumstances, change. We should see that evidence in the text as the agents themselves are explaining why they did something. So the book, has a lot of words in it. Some of those words are here. But tracing across 6 substantive chapters, I cover that 75-year sweep of the rivalry. You can see just in the year chunks of time that there's an earlier focus because, as I'll talk about, there's more evidence on that earlier period. But in the later years, I tried, and the commentators can help assess how well I did, to use other sources, media, as well as interviews with dozens of diplomats and former generals on both sides, to try to talk through more recent periods where we don't have as good of evidence from the primary sources to trace that out. So I'm just going to zoom, and I did want to put a plug that this is the golden age for working on South Asian foreign policy. We have more evidence now that's easily available at our fingertips than we've ever had. And part of it is just good luck. So the foreign ministry in India, the external affairs ministry, under Shiv Shankar Menon, who some of you will know, authorized the declassification of a 10-volume set of documents between India and Pakistan. And not just the declassification, you can get this in hard copy, but it's also available on the MEA website. 10,000 pages of documents because Shiv Shankar Menon thought that they should exist in the world. And in fact, in the prelude of Basin, the editor says, Menon said, get it out there, so I got it out there, right? And he's done a similar, not available sadly online, 5-volume history of the India-China relationship. All of the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru have been published now up to Nehru's death, which was not the case even 5 years ago, wasn't the case at the beginning of this project. And then I used a lot of UK and US documents as well. And the UK Foreign and Commonwealth archives are also widely available online. So for students out there, this is the time to be working on some of these issues, especially in the first 3 decades of India-Pakistan's history. So let me zoom in on just one set of cases in the 1970s, when we moved from the fall of Dhaka through the heights of Shimla and the normalization process and then the collapse again. So we see several of our protagonists that show up again in the book in many cases. A young Benazir, Zulfikar, and Indira in particular, all at Shimla in the summer of 1972 to figure out what to do after the 1971 war. And what I want to note in this case is the process of normalizing India-Pakistan relations did not occur when the power asymmetry between India and Pakistan was most stark. In fact, Zulfikar argued successfully that he needed time to consolidate authority before he could engage in real peacemaking with India. And a lot of the normalization, the bulk of the normalization, happens years after India had released all of its coercive levers that it had, right? So rather than some bargaining theory in which, when India has Pakistan over the barrel, that's when Pakistan will make the concessions occur long after some of those coercive levers are actually released. And instead, the domestic political situation of Zulfikar matters more. So, the chapter starts with this fact, which I think should not be forgotten, that Bhutto was a real pain in the ass for the military dictator Yahya during the 1970-1971 crisis. Now, the military behaved abysmally during the East Pakistan crisis, but at no point did Zulfikar Bhutto allow the military any space to make it easier for them. And in fact, periodically, there was this hijacking episode that occurs in the crisis. Bhutto goes out of his way to try to aggravate that episode. In fact, even very sympathetic biographers of Bhutto talk about how he has no regard for Pakistan's strategic situation, and how he handled that made it harder for West Pakistan to fly over India and get access to East Pakistan. And then as it's clear to everyone in December that full-scale war is right around the corner, and Yahya would have to make enormous concessions to East Pakistan to get any chance to avert a military catastrophe, Bhutto is going out of his way in public to tell Yahya, don't do this. The government of Pakistan is not your ancestral estate. You can't give away East Pakistan. You, military dictator, cannot deal with these international conspirators with language that might echo the present moment. Just because you want to, don't give it away. Yahya's boxed in. Yahya gets into a war. And Yahya has agency here. He made many mistakes during the crisis. And that war goes catastrophically for Pakistan. But Bhutto, despite egging Yahya on the whole time, getting to this war, the war redounds to his benefit, right? He rises to power through a mini coup, basically, in Islamabad in the end of 1971. And he gets into office and he's realized we're in a hell of a mess. He tells the U.S. ambassador, he's like, I don't know how I'm going to fix this problem that I, in part, contributed to. And India had all these coercive levers. It had 90,000 prisoners of war. It was still, India held thousands of square kilometers of Pakistani territory in the West, and there are essentially no lines of communication between the two states. And as he gets ready for peace talks at Shimla in the summer of 1972, he convinces the Indians and convinces the Americans that he can't alienate the military so early in his tenure. And at Shimla, we know from Indira Gandhi's advisors and foreign policy aides that were there on the Indian side, he talks all the time about his enemies at home. The army bosses, at one point I think he refers to them as like the Lahore faction, and he tells Indira, I'm going to need some more time. I can't put everything on the table here. Now, I would say the dominant narrative in India is that Bhutto was successfully using hand-tying techniques. I was in the US government, so I understand that. I used to go to my Indian counterparts and say, oh, dear Indian counterparts, I would love to give you what you want, but I can't because my hands are tied. So I get that is a sign of successful negotiations. That's something that's clear in Putnam's two-level games article, so that's happening, there's no doubt. But he does manage to convince some very smart people, Indira Gandhi is not one to fall for foolishness, that he is indeed in jeopardy at home. And then additionally, once he does stabilize himself, we do start seeing concessions, which is indicative that it wasn't all a ruse. He tells someone in his party, someone close to him, tells the New York Times contemporaneously that he has agreed with Indira Gandhi that ideally there'd be some conversion of the line of control into a frontier, and that slowly trade and travel would increase over time. So we have a lot of contemporaneous evidence that Bhutto was telling the Indians something in public and private about what his desired interstate was. And you do see slow normalization, despite even as early as 1973, or as late as 1973, the US Embassy says people here in Islamabad are writing off the whole effort. But the pressure doesn't go away. The strategic incentives don't back off. So the oil shock hits India and Pakistan in 1973. That causes an inflationary spike in both India and Pakistan. India kind of gets it under control, but gets into a deflationary spiral. And as a result, the Indian economy struggles in real per capita terms in the 70s. Pakistan does somewhat better, but is still treading water. And those incentives to fix the problem are sitting for Bhutto and Indira throughout the period. So some evidence that they're feeling that economic pressure. I won't go into that here. And we see Bhutto in private being quite candid with the Indians that he is still trying to buy space. He sends his principal foreign policy aide, Aziz Ahmed, over to tell them that Bhutto's domestic policy agenda cannot be achieved as long as defense expenditures are going as high as they are. And Bhutto invites the Indians over for a talk. P.N. Huxar, who's Indira Gandhi's primary principal political and foreign policy advisor during this period, Bhutto tells Huxar that he's worried about these centers of chauvinism. He knows he's trying to get these Pakistani prisoners of war released on the Indian side. And in particular, there's 200, roughly 195, that are alleged to be war criminals because of how they repressed the East Pakistani revolt. And we have in the records now him telling the Indians, I don't care about these prisoners of war. You can throw them all into the Ganges for all I care about. But what I can't have is trials that are going to cause me domestic political problems here at home. But once he is able to push his constitution, which he essentially drafts through the National Assembly, then he can start making concessions. So we see in the records that he had told the Indians that he would recognize Bangladesh after his constitution is in place. After the constitution is in place on August 14th, by the end of the month, they're able to achieve repatriation of everything but the 195 that are alleged Pakistani prisoners of war that are alleged of war crimes. By 1974, a few months later, Bhutto agrees to recognize Bangladesh, which had been a sticking point for a long time. And then in April of 1974, they resume opening communication links, postal, air, and others. And so one thing you do when you're doing research is you go around and ask people, why did this thing occur? So I asked a US diplomat that was based in Islamabad in the 1970s, why did he think Bhutto waited until 74 to normalize relations? And this diplomat said, well, he thought by 74 he could do it safely within the background of Pakistani politics. And importantly for this case is Bhutto ends up in part miscalculating the control he has over the military. But this diplomat who was there in the 70s said that in his sense, both Bhutto and in this case the US Embassy thought that Bhutto had total control over the Pakistani establishment. And so once he had that control by the mid-1970s, then he started doing things that were more politically dangerous with India. Even though in the end that turned out to be an incorrect assessment, the military was less under Bhutto's thumb than Bhutto or the US Embassy believed. In India, Indira Gandhi is already in incredible control of the establishment by 1971, after especially the fall of Dhaka. But she consolidates even further with the announcement of the emergency in 1975, and the final restoration of diplomatic relations occurs in 1976, when both Bhutto and Gandhi are arguably at their political peaks. Newly appointed ambassadors arrive, in fact, with the inauguration of air flights. They're on the first flights of each other's respective airlines in both capitals in July of 1976. I won't need to go in to explain, the evidence that Indira Gandhi was in charge, but, when shortly before her political opponent Morarji Desai is arrested, he's sort of complaining to the press that she's not a prime minister, she's an empress now of India, that she's really in this unparalleled control of the state. And the US Embassy at the time is in classified settings, reporting back to DC, what it sees is a pattern of Indira de-energizing rival power centers at home, and then at the same time using that political space to deal with troublesome foreign policy issues, not just with Pakistan, but also Bangladesh, China, and Nepal, right? So that consolidation is doing all the tough stuff she's doing because of that space that she's afforded. But then Bhutto, as is the case with many Pakistani leaders who have appointed their own army chiefs, he had appointed an army chief, Zia-ul-Haq, and had less civilian authority over the military than he expected. And the rapprochement was halted when the Pakistan military comes in 1977. Now, I have no doubt, and Pakistani commentators, as well as American observers of Pakistan during this time period, I think are convincing that the primary space for army intervention is created by a political crisis that's in Pakistan. But I do think there's some evidence that the intervention was in part motivated by the desire to spoil this rapprochement process. So at Bhutto's sort of show trial, the military accuses him of having made a secret deal with India. The evidence is, in fact, that he did probably make a secret deal with India, so that's probably a valid allegation in a way. We also, the trade that Bhutto starts normalizing in the 70s, you see in the trade data that it's halted by the military almost immediately upon Zia coming to office. And then another, again, piece of speech evidence. I talked to an Indian diplomat who is based in Islamabad at the time of the coup, in fact, and saw Bhutto shortly before he was overthrown, arrested that day. This diplomat told me, this very senior Indian diplomat told me that in his assessment, Bhutto was removed without question because the army felt he was too soft on India. This is a diplomat that spent a lot of time with Bhutto talking about Bhutto's desires for the India relationship going forward. Okay, so that's just sort of one case. What I'm trying to do in each case is trace changes in domestic political configurations in one state and how that manifests in the bilateral relationship. And just two last closing thoughts before I hear from these very wise people that Professor Varshini is kind enough to gather for me today, is just to note that leaders are obsessed with their domestic political survival. They really have great difficulty thinking about the long future. And so if we were to watch the incentives they face alone, it will poorly explain their behavior. And then on a contemporary note, I am incredibly pessimistic about the situation in contemporary Pakistan because the authority is so fractured that even though I think the incentives clearly favor a continuation of some rapprochement between India and Pakistan, the political environment there, I don't think, can permit it to hold for very long. So thank you.
This is how we will proceed with the commentary. Christine Fair will go first, and then Asfandyar Mir, and finally Tyler Jost. That's the plan. Yeah. Chris Fair is a professor in the Peace and Security Studies program at Georgetown. Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. She's been very kind to us here at Brown. This is probably her third or fourth visit. And she's commented on book manuscripts here of our junior colleagues. She's been on panels on Afghanistan, etc. Her work, most recent book is, in their own words, Understanding the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Oxford University Press. She presented that book to a seminar I used to organize in Delhi every year until COVID hit. That seminar as well. So before that, she co-authored, co-edited several books. Fighting to the End, one of my favorite books on Pakistan. The Pakistani Army's Way of War, Oxford University's Press, Pakistan's Enduring Challenges, Policing Insurgencies, Political Islam and Governance in Bangladesh. He's worked in Bangladesh as well. And the Madrasa Challenge, Militancy and Religious Education in Pakistan, among some other books as well. So, Chris, about 12 to 15 minutes for your commentary. Yeah.
Well, I'll probably be more brief than that. But I actually want to thank you, Professor Varshna. You're such a supporter of junior scholars, and I mean, it's just really nice to have a colleague like you in this business. It honestly, you inspire me. I hope that you know, I can have that kind of role too with junior scholars. It really means a lot. And then this guy, he makes me feel old because when I first met him, I think were you Peter Lavoie's?
Even earlier, I think.
Even earlier, yeah. I just feel really, really old. I remember your roommate stories when you lived in D.C. So we go a long way back, and we both did tours of duty at the Rund Corporation, is what I prefer to call it. So that's an inside joke if you know it. So this is just a great book, and I think one of the things so I'm not a political scientist. I study South Asian languages and civilizations. So I don't do this sort of grandiose theorizing. But I think Chris has put forward a really novel contribution in this book. And he does two things I think are really unique that scanning the literature, there's actually three things scanning the literature that he does. First, he actually looks at peace. Right. This is actually not something that people have typically looked at. I mean, I think about Shumbik Ganguly's approach. He really dilates upon the most obvious of conflicts. But Chris looks at opportunities for peace and where those opportunities have been explored, even if they haven't fructified. The other thing that he does is he actually looks at the universe of cases, or at least the universes of cases that can be empirically observed. And I really applaud your introduction of the Bengal crisis. There aren't a lot of people who look at that, and I think that is a really fruitful place that you spend a lot of time digging into. And the other thing that he does is that he focuses upon elites in both Pakistan and India. Now, this too is very difficult to do. And this really goes to Chris's credit. Many of us who study South Asia, by virtue of the, there's no nice way of putting it, embassies basically bribe scholars with visas. So it's not a mystery that after my book on the Pakistan Army that I can't go back to Pakistan. It turns out that the men on horseback really don't like brassy women. But, and so people are sort of perforce, you have to sort of tread these different lines with these embassies. Right now, I'm, afraid of getting PNG'd by India. I think we all are in one way or another. So what Chris has been able to do is what a lot of scholars haven't been able to do, which is to forge parallel ties in both countries. There are very few people who can do that with integrity. So this, I think, really speaks to Chris's, not only his intellectual bandwidth, but also his personal bandwidth. He's just a good guy. He's like the Easter Bunny. You can't get pissed off at the Easter Bunny, right?
And he might not exist.
Oh, he exists. I got the cavities to prove it. So, and then the other thing that this book offers, like I said, it's four things, is that I really liked this comment that you made, because if anyone who's ever been to my house, my entire basement has been converted to a woman cave. I had shelves built. I mean, it is literally my library. It just is. So Chris makes this comment that you literally have to build a library to get a panoptic vision of the different crises, or just even a history of South Asia. So what makes this book, and I'm thinking very seriously about putting aspects of it or parts of it on my syllabus, is that it's a pretty good go-to to get a good, summary about these different conflicts. Now, I might quibble with the narrative that you wrap around it. Like, for example, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the narrative that you gave for the 1947-48 conflict. And I was kind of wondering if you saw Shuja Nawaz's piece, The First Kashmir War Revisited, because in that piece, he gives us, and of course, Shuja Nawaz, he's basically the brother of Asif Nawaz, right, who was like a former army chief who died. There's all kinds of stories about how he may have died. At one end, it was a dangerous combination of booze, a treadmill, and Viagra, and then apparently poison. So if you actually, anyone had the chance to see the original Shuja Nawaz manuscript, the book was written in large measure to show that, in fact, his brother was the victim of nefariousness. And the autopsy report with a photograph, a photocopy of a lock of Asif Nawaz's hair is actually still in the copy that I have. So anyway, his article, which is largely based upon his unique and privileged access to Pakistan Army archives, gives a little bit more heft to the narrative that this was not non-state. And it raises for me the question, what level of state support does it have to be state support? It's really clear from Shuja Nawaz's piece, The First Kashmir War Revisited, that we've got provincial support from the NWFP and from the Punjab. They're providing the logistics. Like, these tribal miscreants didn't just end up all by themselves. And then he also gives a different story about when the Pakistan vice army chief gets involved after the army chief goes on leave. So I'm kind of interested in what does it mean to be state versus non-state, especially in Pakistan, where from my point of view, Pakistan sort of develops this tactic, maybe it's a strategy, I don't know, where it deliberately smudges the lines between a state and a non-state actor for what, in my view, is just increasingly implausible, plausible deniability. And so in my own work, I argue that Pakistan develops this really going back to 47, 48. And you know what? It worked for them, right? And we see in 1965 that the balance shifts but you still have Pakistan army personnel dressed as civilians, right? And then we have in Kargil the same thing. So, you can sort of like trace out this state use of non-state actors. And that's leaving aside a point that I'm going to come to in a minute, the formal terrorist groups that Pakistan uses under its unfurling nuclear umbrella to prosecute asymmetrically what Pakistan can't do straightforwardly. The other thing that I'm really struck by in your book, and he writes so well, he doesn't use jargon. I mean, it's just a really good book, dude. Really a good book. So, but what I'm really struck by is that when you assess that leaders have a strategic incentive to pursue peace, in many cases, they don't see their strategic incentives as you do. And so they're not, so if we were basically playing the game of, I guess what you political scientists might call game theoretic rationality, they would behave as you predict, but clearly they don't. And I'm thinking in particular, Nehru. And I'm wondering, how do you explain so many times when these actors are not behaving in a game theoretically rational way? And then this also leads me to a related question to the state versus non-state elision, is that particularly in the period of Ayyub's tenure, and I would say under Imran Khan, it's not clear. So it seems like ex ante, you're picking who the leader is in any given play. And so, because I'm kind of like OCD, I would have preferred that you defined at the outset who you think the leader is. Because at different points, especially in Ayyub's tenure, boy, sometimes it's Ali. I mean, it sort of moves around, and I feel uncomfortable with the ex ante decision of who is the leader. And I really would have liked to have pulled some quotes from one of our favorite scholars on the Pakistan Army's reliance upon racist assessments of Indians, because there are so many that span across the Pakistani literature, which speaks to a little bit of, I make an argument about strategic culture where they deploy this way of understanding India, which again defies game theoretic rationality. So I wanted to also ask you questions, and I'm sorry, this is just like me rapid firing because it really was such a good book, and it just provoked a lot of questions. So your treatment in the 1971 war, it kind of reminds me of like the Bohr model of the atom. It just simplifies this complex space of actors. And so, and again, thinking about another book that you helped put together is Elena Biberman's book. So I was thinking of her book when I read your chapter. So many times this gets condensed to an India-Pakistan conflict when there's at least 3 conflicts, right? There's the inner Pakistan conflict, right? And so I was asking myself, well, who's actually the player of interest in this war developing with India? Is it Mujib? Is it Yahya? And what I'm struck by the historical record, and which is why I applaud you for the attempt to provide a condensed account of this conflict, is that there's really not agreement on who was the good guy and the bad guy. I find myself really siding with Raghavan that they were both schmucks, that Mujib would have happily taken a concession if there had been a concession to be given. I'm thinking, Owen Bennett Jones, he gives us a very pleasant reading of Yahya, but it's also really clear that Yahya going into these elections doesn't think it's going to turn out this way. And he already has a pre-cooked constitution that keeps him in place. And then Zulfikar, across all historical accounts, is just an unadulterated shyster. So the most maximalist critical views of him, I don't think, are cruel enough to describe his cruelty. But so in thinking then about your model, so that's just within Pakistan crisis. Then you have all these non-state actors, that you've got that axis of conflict. And then you have the India-Pakistan crisis. So it's nice that you flattened it for analytical purposes, but I don't feel like it captures the multiple player game across time that really animates that conflict. And so I was really hoping that you might discuss that. It's a conflict that it doesn't get the robust treatment that it deserves. I think Raghavan might be one of the few people that looks consistently across all these axes, but even he doesn't really do that. All right, so I know you relied a lot upon those. So this is just an empirical question. It's not a criticism. So thank you for having not a manel. So I've also read a lot of U.S. government descriptions of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and they are misogynist. They are outright misogynist as hell. And given that you're relying upon, I haven't spent so much time with the British archives as you, but I'm wondering, since you rely so heavily upon these archives to create your assessment of her leadership, how did you deal? I know you're married to Nilofer. She probably would have kicked you in the booty had you not noted the misogyny. But I'm wondering how you, as a woke dude, handled that in your synthesis. And then thank you for that explanation of Shimla, because you kind of obviated this question that I had. And then there's 2 other empirical challenges that I had with this. And I think when we all write books, you have to have a narrative. And so you have to put things in one place or another, even if they don't nicely fit with the empirics. So you put the bomb, right, in the Zia chapter. And I agree, you indicate, we have multiple sources that say Pakistan certainly had a bomb by a crude device by 83 and the means to deliver it off of, say, a C-17. Some sources put it as early as 1980. And Zia when Zulfikar in his book, If I'm Assassinated, and of course we know he was, he puts a lot of the credit to himself, right? Which we know he did, catching up. So my question for you, and I'm thinking specifically about brass tacks, I view that as a nuclear crisis from the point of view of nuclear overhang. But I'm struck, and we also know that Desai had been briefed by the U.S. government on Pakistan's progress. And Morarji Desai says, well, if they get the bomb, we're just going to have to bomb them. And obviously, I'm not sure how we would take that proclamation seriously. But I'm curious to know, because you don't say this explicitly. I know you cite Vipin's work, but there is this, at some point on Pakistani thinking, and I think the Pakistanis see it earlier than the Indians see it, that they can leverage nuclear overhang to its advantage. So from my point of view, I see brass tacks as a nuclear crisis, right? And you kind of say as much as well, but you kind of skirt around it. So at what point, in your view, do Pakistani leaders believe that they have nuclear overhang, and then obviously after 1998, an explicit nuclear umbrella to protect them? And I've saved this question for last because this is the biggest pain in the ass question. Throughout the book, you downplay Pakistani support for non-state actors. And, I did my dissertation on the Khalistan insurgency, and I saw the ISI's my first time I went to Pakistan for a lengthy period of time. I saw the ISI's apparatus. Ladies, they think you're stupid, and then they show you shit. It's like, I love being a woman in Pakistan. I mean, I just did. So they showed me this radio station that they had set up where they were communicating in Punjabi. All of their Punjabi actors, they learned Gurmukhi to communicate. I had the privilege of going to many of the gurdwaras in Pakistan where they were actively recruiting. I actually met one of the famed Sikh hijackers who took the plane from Delhi to Amritsar and landed in Lahore. At the end of that, he did ask if I could arrange his marriage to an American Sikh so he could move to the U.S. I was like, I think that whole hijacking prosecution and, it might be a problem for you, bro, but, I'll keep it under advisement. So I saw firsthand, like, the ISI facilitation of the Khalistan movement. And I do a lot of work on these clowns. So your description of the Punjab crisis and brass tacks doesn't really do justice to what the Pakistanis were up to in the Punjab. And what I think is actually really remarkable about the Pakistanis, if you think about that time period, right, they were basically fomenting insurgency, supporting insurgency very aggressively in Punjab. They're running an insurgency in Kashmir, and they were trying to do stuff, in Afghanistan, they were trying to do stuff in Kashmir. And then we know from Zia's own writing that the groups he supported in Afghanistan, he gave the most support to those groups that he would later deploy to Kashmir. And he said this explicitly, right? And various writers who worked with him have also said this explicitly. So similarly, when you get to the Indian Parliament attack by Jaish, and then the Kaluchak attack by Lashkar, you give a very benign description of those events. And, I want to bounce something off of you. No one else thinks like this except me. So maybe I'm just like unusually mean or something. But Pakistan had a strategic incentive for that Jaish attack. And let me pack this out for you. I work across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. So the timing of that Jaish attack was critical because if you will recall, we were running Operation Anaconda, right? Jaish was always a primordial ally of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, right? The Deobandi groups are really the allies of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. So is it a coincidence that this attack happens by a Taliban Osama bin Laden ally just as we are getting ready to go? And Pakistan knows this because we are relying upon Pakistan to be the anvil to our hammer or the hammer to the anvil. I don't do hardware. I don't know which one is which, but they knew this. And so as a result of this attack, Pakistan says to Wendy Chamberlain, who was then the ambassador, sorry, lady, we have to move all of our forces from the west to the east. And this happens exactly during the time period when we know categorically Osama bin Laden was transiting from Afghanistan to Pakistan. So I know I floated this. The problem is most people who study this region don't, I mean, Asfandyar, I know you're also trying to look at, most people don't look at both countries holistically, right? So similarly, Pakistan had another incentive with the LET attack at Kaluchuk for the exact same reason, right? While these attacks are occurring, this is allowing Pakistan to retain its focus on the east and not the west, while all of its thugs are escaping and ensconcing themselves in Pakistan. So I was really struck by you playing down this, and I was struck by it, but then also theoretically, because in my understanding of the same conflict space that you're looking at, asymmetric escalation and de-escalation is also a kind of peacemaking and peace building. And that doesn't, and so by you kind of wiggling out of that, you kind of missed an opportunity to look at other spaces for peacemaking and conflict making. I hope you won't beat me for saying that, but it was.
No beatings.
Okay. I might be old, but I'm still mean.
I have peace in the title of my book. I'm a very peaceful person.
You are.
No beatings.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Asfandyar Mir is our next commentator. He's a senior expert in the South Asia program at the U.S. Institute of Peace and has worked extensively on international relations of South Asia, U.S. counterterrorism policy, and I think a great deal on non-state actors. That's fair to say. I've been reading your shorter pieces on non-state actors quite a lot. So, it's been published in International Security, International Studies Quarterly, Perspectives on Politics, Security Studies, and the PhD is from Chicago, if I know. It's
Right.
not in my notes here, but it's from Chicago, right?
It is,
Yeah.
yes.
But we don't hold that against him.
Yes. Okay, Asfandyar.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Varshney. Thank you for having me, and thank you for having me as part of this particular crew. Delighted to be here, and delighted for the opportunity to comment on Chris Clary's important, remarkable book for international relations and South Asia security. So, I don't want to rehash the argument. I think you stated it up front, and then Chris, of course, gave a very compelling presentation of the key arguments. But I will start with what I think is the main implication of this argument for, say, ending rivalries and conflicts, what we sometimes refer to as conflict resolution, which is that we need powerful strategic incentives for rivals in a dyad, combined with a lot of authority vested in the leaders of those rival countries to get to peace. That's the implication. We're talking about really compelling incentives and really a lot of authority. I want to emphasize the intensity that's needed on both sides, for both of those variables, and that is a very sobering conclusion, because especially for South Asia, because it appears highly unlikely that India and Pakistan will get to that stage in the near to medium term. So I have remarkably little hope for the India-Pakistan sort of rivalry to meaningfully abate if I buy your theory, Chris. Okay, so that's the implication. But some comments. I'm a political scientist. Most of my work is in IR, is published in journals of IR, and I have to say that the book is remarkable, is a major contribution of IR. And I will start with a criticism of IR theory works, which really struggle with nuanced conceptions of war and peace. A lot of our dependent variables are, for the lack of a better word, just blah. We work with binary outcomes like incidents of war or peace, really binary. That's the Cornell Security series of years past. I'd still love to be published in the Cornell Security series, but that's the nature of dependent variables in that series. The more nuanced dependent variables we've been able to come up with include, say, the militarized interstate dispute variable MIDS, as we call them. Interesting, but still very limited. More creative colleagues have pivoted towards scales of escalation, vertical escalation, horizontal escalation. Again, these approaches are commendable, but ultimately very sterile in my opinion, because the scale of conflictual behavior is marred much less by discrete incidents of violence, but by non-violent conflictual activities, what commentators, analysts, and journalists often refer to as tensions in the relationship, right? And on the side of cooperation, grand conciliation, things like Sadat going to Jerusalem type events, all-out arms control, peace treaties are really the extreme of what cooperation can amount to. They happen for sure, but are uncommon. And more run-of-the-mill cooperation, which is common among rivals, involves moderate conciliatory initiatives, trade, people-to-people contact, back channels, and so on. And I think Chris really captures this reality of conflict and cooperation among rivals really, really well, because I think for Chris, South Asia is not just a case, as tends to be the case for a lot of political scientists, IR scholars, including myself. It's a history he deeply understands. He gets sequencing as a former policymaker himself. I think he's able to situate sort of initiatives in their time, the constraints policymakers confront. So I think he uses this understanding of the historical record to give us a fine-grained conception, typology even, of levels of conflict and conciliation. And he captures a lot of political action that happens on this spectrum of conflict and cooperation. So that's great, and I hope IR scholars learn from him on that count. His other major contribution is to IR again, is he shows persuasively how incomplete these power-centric theories are when it comes to explaining outcomes of war and peace. And the family of relative power theories is where I have turned to often predict whether we should expect a thaw, an effort at a back channel, a bold meeting of rivals at a summit, in South Asia, but also in other cases. And given my background in Civil War studies, I've been especially drawn to this notion of a mutually hurting stalemate as the prerequisite for conciliation, peace processes, as well as for interstate rivalries. And I think Chris convincingly shows that these relative power considerations are important, but ultimately insufficient, without understanding the politics around the leader making the big decision. So he really helps advance this canon of power-centric theories. Finally, his biggest contribution is in highlighting the role of domestic political factors, while persuasively refuting regime-type arguments. So I'd say we have spent far too much time in IR testing and debating regime-type theories for war and peace, especially the variant of democratic peace theory. If we ever needed one, I think Chris's book can serve as the last nail in the coffin of democratic peace theory, or its variant implications for peacemaking at least. More significantly, I think Chris shows how domestic politics can be remarkably similar on questions of conciliation or conflict, that veto players can be mighty challenging to deal with in non-democratic contexts, even in the absence of audiences and whatever costs that they may be able to impose. Okay, so that's all the good stuff. I have 3 comments which are sort of more critical, and I think they offer an opportunity for discussion, perhaps more research as well. I have 1 question inquiry related to contemporary events, which is of interest to me, perhaps relevant to policy debates that I'll come to towards the end of those 3 comments. So first things first, I think Chris provokes us with a premise that should be controversial, that preferences for conflict or cooperation are a function of strategic incentives, so threat perception and resource availability. On the face of it, this sounds like a fairly rational construct. So in his telling, there is a balance sheet of strategic incentives in the minds of leaders. It's all very objective. And so when strategic circumstances dictate lowering of temperature, bold conciliation should follow. We should see efforts at those sorts of things. I think as a matter of theory, it's an okay starting point. But I will note that it's an unobvious one. If you're familiar with major IR theories, in particular, it's a bargaining theory. I mean, in Fearon's infamous exposition on causes of war, disagreement on costs of war due to irrational mutual optimism, it's a cause of war. And we see plenty of motivated reasoning about the adversary over time across cases. The adversary is weak, it's a paper tiger in the South Asian context, Hindus don't know how to fight, things of that nature. So, I think South Asian security analysts are skeptical of strategic incentives being a good starting point. I think IR scholars are as well. So I wonder, if there are ways to operationalize this variable in non-material terms as well. So my question is, does the theory have to be so wedded to material dimensions of strategic incentives? And what do you think of these other potential preferences for war and peace? Could it be that if you start on a path of rapprochement for the wrong reasons, say just to buy time, you're only likely to get very far or not too far, perhaps? And could that explain any of the key episodes in the India-Pakistan rivalry? Okay, that's comment number one. Second comment, I think the theory is all about leadership and its ability to push through conciliation against the tide of hawkish veto points. Yet the theory is ultimately light on the preferences of leaders for peace and conciliation, what the right way to sue for peace is. And that, to my mind, or these preferences of leaders, how they feel about peacemaking, it is an important alternative story for a number of conciliatory initiatives. And it rivals the strategic incentives argument. And where I wanted to see that falsified was on Shimla. I think Indira's decision to agree to the summit in the first place and subsequent decision to not force a fait accompli on Kashmir in particular, I have always inferred that to be a function of Indira's sort of personal preferences. And there's this really interesting paragraph, even in your discussion on the Indian debate on forcing a settlement, on Kashmir, that remember the Treaty of Versailles, let's not humiliate the Pakistanis, let's not weaken Bhutto, etc., which suggests, to me at least, that there were unique ideas on part of the Indian leadership, more than strategic incentives, perhaps, that were driving the type of conciliation we see at Shimla. And similarly, in 1999, Vajpayee's decision to travel to Lahore and Sharif's decision to receive him, I am not persuaded that you could explain them from a strategic incentive sort of lens as well. Especially if we buy the story of Musharraf and his friends that Sharif had been somewhat briefed on Kargil. That makes it all the more unlikely that Sharif went for the summit due to debilitating strategic problems. Clearly, if his generals thought they had other options other than deal making to bring the conflict to a close on their terms, and Sharif knew about them, then there's no reason for him to feel that he was strategically constrained and therefore needed to receive Vajpayee in Lahore. Okay. Third comment, I think the theory promises an explanation for higher rungs of conflict, that is perhaps the path of war. But ultimately, I wasn't clear if the theory was as well specified to predict war and sort of higher rungs of conflict. I took away two main mechanisms of war and conflict in how you discussed the empirics of some of the key episodes. First, I think the mechanism you offer is that strategic incentives imply lower costs of war than the status quo at certain times, and because veto players prefer conflict over cooperation, there are no barriers. We land into war. So that would be the story of the 1965 war, which the book, I think this is a novel contribution, describes as a case of preventive war by the Pakistanis in the face of a rapidly closing power differential. So, very poorly executed war, but preventive nonetheless. So that's one mechanism. The other mechanism seems to be veto players, alarmed by bold efforts of their leaders, spoil the peace effort, step in and steer the rivalry towards higher rungs of conflict, and that would be the story of 99 Kargil. Both of those are interesting, important mechanisms, but two conflictual episodes which I wanted the theory to shed more light on, and I felt that these mechanisms are insufficient for them, are one, Pakistan's support for the insurgency in Kashmir, especially in early to mid 1990s, and then the Modi government's coercive strategy towards Pakistan since 2016. So, how can the leadership primacy theory account for both of those periods? I think I'm very interested in that. All right, so those are the comments on the theory. Final point I'll make is, and this sort of tease off from what you said about the prospects of India-Pakistan rapprochement, that they're bad because of leadership authority fracture in Pakistan. I think that makes a lot of sense. And especially under this government, the PMLN government in Pakistan, fracture of authority is likely to persist at least until the election. The government has all sorts of problems, agreed. But I wonder about Modi government's calculus on Pakistan amid intensifying India-China competition, which shows no sign of abating. I think your theory implies that Modi should want to sue for peace, or at least lower the intensity of the conflict and competition right now. Perhaps he's prevented by the problems in Pakistan. Then is that your interpretation for why the ceasefire was restored and holds until now, and these back channel talks continue, which are obviously two-way? I mean, it's not just the Pakistanis talking; the Indians are talking as well. So how would you interpret kind of what's going on in the current moment? Again, congratulations on what is a terrific contribution, and thank you, Ashu, for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tyler Jost is our last commentator. He is an assistant professor here in my department and at the Watson Institute, recruited for his specialization in Chinese security, but I've always noted noted with great pleasure how much he knows about South Asian security, not just Chinese security. And secondly, I also thought there is a methodological reason for inviting someone who spends more time on non-South Asian matters than on South Asian matters. Well, then you can come to the forest in a different way, right? And if you are a specialist of the region, then you're inside the forest, if you will. And so these generate very different insights. And let's see what Tyler has to say. His first book, Bureaucracy in War, is forthcoming at Cambridge University Press, and so he has also quite a lot to say, I think, on internal power dynamics on security issues.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ashu, for inviting me to this panel, and thank you to Chris for writing such a thought-provoking and interesting book. As Ashu was just saying, he's asked me to focus on some of the cross-national and theoretical aspects of the book, which I will do as the other two panelists who preceded me know far more about the details of South Asian security than I ever will. I will say the one thing empirically that I would know, I was drawn to that exact same sentence that you brought out or pointed out, Professor Fair, which is one does have to collect a small library in order to adequately study many of the episodes which have been so nicely and succinctly put into a single volume with this book. And so it's a real contribution to the field empirically, from my perspective, for that alone. So I think it's obvious at this point that the foremost theoretical contribution of this book is to try to unpack the domestic politics of international rivalry. Now that might sound, I guess, like an obvious thing, but when one surveys the literature on international rivalry in international relations theory, one is struck by just how much is focused on what we would call structural or system level factors, A lot of work that is primarily quantitative in nature. And one of the wonderful things about this book is, while it perhaps is obvious to us that domestic politics should matter, there's not a lot of theoretical treatment about how it might. Chris's intervention, more specifically in this regard, I think, is to note that the end of rivalry, the termination of rivalry, is in part a domestic political problem, one in which you have to have four actors come to agreement. So you have to have the leader on side A, the leader on side B, and then crucially, as Chris points out, both of their domestic constituencies, what IR theorists would call domestic audiences. So that's a thorny coordination problem to solve, even if preferences align, right? Maybe information goes bad and you can't get all actors on the same page. But then things get particularly thorny as we begin to introduce players with different preferences. Chris's theoretical intuition, I think, if I'm understanding the argument correctly, is that leaders that have what he terms primacy can effectively circumvent two of those players, the domestic audiences on both sides, when they're kind of these strong individuals, right? Because these leaders enjoy absolute authority over the foreign policy decision-making process, all that's required for them to seek peace is for them to believe that it's in their interest to do so. They don't have to worry about all of these domestic spoilers. You might have heard the phrase that it takes a hawk like Nixon to go to China. I think Chris's version of that argument is that it takes a strong man to go to China to make peace. One of the reasons that this argument is so intriguing is that there's a natural tension, I think, with many other scholarly accounts, which emphasize what we might call the deleterious or negative consequences of primacy, or what other scholars would call personalism. Chris actually uses the term personalism as one of the component parts of primacy, which is a very thought-provoking and controversial claim, right? So when we think about personalist rulers in the past, we often think about folks like Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro, which other IR scholarship has shown, in large part to kind of refute some of the coarse explorations of the democratic peace, that there's some real downsides associated with that much power consolidated in a single individual. Why is that problematic? Well, it's problematic because there are no spoilers, there are no veto players to hold that individual to account if they deviate in ways that are harmful to the state's interests. And it's also potentially problematic in the sense that the same types of leaders that have motive to and are successful in consolidating power tend to also be the same leaders that tend to skew hawkish and the same leaders that tend to skew risk acceptant. Now, this isn't a universal principle, but if one looks cross-nationally, there's a good deal of statistical evidence that suggests that is the case. But if Chris's story is correct, then the scholarship of folks like Jessica Weeks, and he had to leave, I think, early, Jeff Colgan, are sort of held on trial, right? Because their work has shown that these personalist dictators tend to be quite prone to violence. Chris is saying that, at least in the context of rivalry termination, personalism is a double-edged sword. Maybe they're prone to violence in the first place. Maybe they're very risk acceptant. But this perhaps underappreciated element of the consolidation of power is that it means that there are no domestic spoilers that could potentially get in the way of a peacemaking process. That is, politically weak doves might prefer peace, but they can't achieve it because their domestic audience spoils. But hawks might prefer rivalry most of the time, but when they can be persuaded to want peace, they are more likely to succeed. And in my read, this argument very clearly illuminates a number of very puzzling episodes, particularly in the Pakistani side of the equation. I'm thinking of, like, in broad senses, it was sometimes the strong military ruler, and here I'm thinking of Ayub Khan and Pervez Musharraf, that were most successful in making progress in lowering the temperature in bilateral relations. And from that perspective, like, that empirical fact, if you take Chris's argument as right on that empirical fact, that is a puzzle for existing IR theories, and I think that Chris's theory helps to illuminate why that is the case. As intriguing as this argument is, however, I think it leaves a couple of important questions unanswered. The first is, I want to know more about how we weigh these two aspects of consolidated political power against one another. Because it wasn't entirely persuasive to me that the positive aspects of power consolidation would outweigh the deleterious aspects. If Chris's argument was strictly true, for example, we would not expect to find high levels of correlation between personalism and international conflict in the second half of the 20th century, as a number of IR scholars have done in the past. Let me use the example of Xi Jinping to illustrate this point more concretely. So if Chris's argument is correct, we might have predicted that Xi's consolidation of power inside of the PRC foreign policy decision-making process would have made the United States and China more likely to have peaceful relations between the two countries. That's obviously not what we observe, right? It occurs at a time in which the rivalry between the United States and China is deepening. Chris makes mention of this possibility in the conclusion of the book, noting that the period that might follow Xi's reign will be even worse, and that might be true. But we can't compare to a future that we can't observe. What we can observe is China prior to Xi, in which I think any observer of Chinese politics would say that Hu Jintao, at the least, if not Jiang Zemin as well, lacked the level of primacy that Chris's theory would sort of normatively prescribe a leader have. And yet it was a period in which the bilateral relationship between the United States and China was far less rivalrous than it was today. There are other puzzles if one looks back at the history of U.S.-China relations in the past. One might be tempted to think, Mao Zedong brought the olive branch to Washington. That is, I suppose, in a way true. It was a personalist ruler that was able to allow for peace to occur. But normalization of relations doesn't actually get implemented until nearly a decade later. And that happens at a moment in which there's some pretty severe fractionalization within the party in the middle of a power struggle between Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping. The second somewhat unanswered question is how we might theorize, and I think Asfandyar talked about this a little bit, theorize the preferences of domestic political players or the domestic audience in Chris's account. In the book, domestic audiences almost always have some reason to spoil the peace process. But when we get to the cases, however, the actual motives that we observe behind the spoiling attempts are actually quite heterogeneous. So in the lead up to the 1999 Kargil War, for example, Chris makes the case that the military had a parochial incentive to ensure that bilateral progress that Nawaz Sharif and Shahbaz Aziz had been making, presumably they believed that Vajpayee would defect on agreements, or they would lock Pakistan out of Siachen, or more cynically, they would just cut the defense budget. But this is a parochial story in which military rulers either skew hawkish on a particular issue or skew hawkish more broadly as part of strategic culture, something like that. But this seems quite a different story from the way that domestic audiences operated other episodes. So, for example, in Chris's telling of the 1965 India-Pakistan War, Bhutto has an almost political incentive to spoil what was Ayub's more peaceful, at least in Chris's account, more peaceful aspirations. And similarly on the Indian side, it was Sonia Gandhi's sort of wanting to get credit for some of the peace process post-Agra initiatives that Musharraf was offering India. In any case, it's not to say that this is necessarily wrong. It's just to say that looking across the gamut of these potential motives, one is struck by how different they are. And if it really is the case that they are quite different, why is it the case that they, what explains why they would be operant in one condition or one period of time and not the other? So finally, I think Chris Books paves the way to think more carefully about the ways that some of these domestic political dynamics shape out, not only or affect the policy outcomes that we observe, in Chris's case, the choice between peace and rivalry, but also the quality of the policy-making process and the quality of information that leaders receive prior to making these decisions. One of the things that I find in studying foreign policy decision-making in these two countries myself is that leaders are not passive bystanders to the domestic political spoilers. They often modify formal and informal institutions regulating the relationship between advisors and bureaucracy to protect themselves from the types of threats that Chris alludes to. So to me, this sort of suggests another pathway by which these domestic political threats might shape foreign policy in rivalrous states, namely the choice to insulate the leadership from political threats and the deleterious consequences that has for the quality of the process in the first place. But all this is to say that there are a number of very interesting roads that have been opened as the result of this scholarship that Chris has produced, and I think we are better off as a field for the questions he's asked and the answers he has posed.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you very much. So now let's see. We have half an hour. Let me, instead of asking Chris to respond to his three commentators, let's see if the audience has some questions, some comments, and then towards the end, you pick what you want to respond to, because you have a whole variety of questions.
Like a battered Rocky Balboa.
Yeah, you have this sort of.
But Rocky always wins.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Any thoughts, any comments from the audience here? Which you've been witness to some very serious discussion about of a very serious book. Any thoughts that come to mind? Gilles Vernier? Yeah.
So just a very quick short question, and thank you everyone for a good discussion so far. So I haven't read the book, so maybe probably the answer is in it, so forgive me for that. But does your theory basically require both sides to have some sort of quality and control over internal processes to basically effectively aspire to a pathway towards peace?
Yes. It has to be on both sides.
Yeah.
That's
so,
the argument.
So that would be a factor that makes basically peace even less likely than rivalry. And then I wanted to echo also with the remark on what is your reading of today's situation in India, because Modi's views or positions vis-a-vis Pakistan seems rather inscrutable to me. I see, so I do domestic politics, so I see a lot of views of the rivalry in domestic politics, but not a lot of action or not a lot of action or attempt at actually drafting a coherent policy one way or another, right? It seems very status quoist to me, and so I was wondering how your book and the theory sort of informs the period that we live in now.
Can I add something to that? So 2019 election data is clear about what were the main determinants of voter preference for Modi 2019. His personality shows up as very high. It's a fourth of the entire BJP vote was his, right? Second largest in the surveys that were conducted by Center for Developing Society and Lokniti, which is one of our main survey researching bodies, was use of Pakistan. For the first time in Indian elections, foreign policy or the use of or bombing or whatever it was in
Pulwama.
and what court was it?
Balakot.
Pulwama and Balakot figured as the second most important.
Well, there was also that film that they made about it as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
As someone who studied elections for a long time, foreign policy was never an electoral issue. And in my exchanges with Ashley Tellis over the years, both he as a scholar of foreign policy and security, I as a scholar of comparative politics, both have come to the same view that foreign policy or security was never in India's mass politics, election politics. 2019 became an exception. So Pakistan was used quite profitably in election politics. And you sent a tweet this morning or yesterday at what are the points in Indian history has this been done? No, it's not. It's never worked in the past. It's part of elite politics, always elite politics. For example, Bombay, after the attack on Bombay, but 6 months or 7 months after that, Congress won handsomely. Its vote went up. Even though BJP tried to tell the voters that here is a completely such a weak government, it can't even stand up to terrorists and stand up to Pakistan, right? No, it didn't matter. In 2009 it didn't matter. And 2019 it mattered finally. So I think Modi has consolidated power, we know that. There are very few internal domestic spoilers for him at this point. Nobody has a big veto against him. Nobody has a big veto against him. I'm not sure his preference is for peace of Pakistan.
Can I
Preference
ask,
is not there.
can I ask you a question about
Yeah.
this point? Because I agree with you. So, I study Hindi film, and the thing, and also not just Hindi film, but Indian serials. And what has really struck me in the last 10 years or so is the mainstreaming of security issues as entertainment in India.
Yeah.
If you're watching like
Kashmir Files.
Absolutely. There's so many of them. Thinking, was it Family Man, right? There's a whole Pakistan ISIS sub-thread. You had the Bard of Blood, which was basically a spy thriller about it, where Indian spies are operating in Balochistan, right? And then you've had the really firm alignment of Bollywood with Modi, with Akshay Kumar. And so I'm wondering if,
This is all very recent.
all very recent,
The
absolutely.
last time Bollywood made a film on war was Hakikat.
Exactly.
That was the India-China war.
Absolutely.
And showing how badly India was
Yep.
humiliated.
Right.
It was turned into a human story. Soldiers losing their lives, their loved ones, waiting for them to come back, or finding them very hard to say goodbye, all that,
Yep.
right? Hakikat was the last, and it had great songs
right.
written by some of the greatest poets. But that was it.
That was it. And then
That
you
was
had
it.
Peloton,
Yeah.
which was a really good remaking of the '62 war, which is sort of, anyway. So I'm struck by this.
By national security becoming a matter in mass politics in recent years, and that's the first time that has happened.
And something else that's happened, if you spend time watching, although I admit it's migraine-inducing, Indian domestic television, right? How many of these retired, colonels who repelled the entire tank division with a dull rubber are now mainstays on Indian news programs?
Yes.
I mean, that's the stuff you only use
Also,
as...
retired Pakistani colonels.
Oh,
They also show up on.
exactly, but the Pakistani retired falanas, they were always a part of Pakistan's news television. This is new in India.
Yes, yes, it is.
It's all part of, this just to
Yeah,
support
yeah.
your claim.
You have a question or a comment? Yeah.
Again, just to follow up on this,
Yeah.
I'm again not having read the book, but I'm just curious about the more economic domestic concerns and how do they tie into this theory that you have? Because as a sort of political economy sort of oriented person, I would expect, do you have an intermediating variable where a size of, let's say, a sort of a class that is not state-oriented or a private sector, because that was one of the big changes that happened in India, is that we grew a very big private sector which was not state-oriented, as against Pakistan, which is, military Inc. is what it's called. Is that, and how does that fit into the sort of more, Machiavellian, calculations? And what does it say about the nature of leadership? Is leader then a sort of, a classless leader, and is that what primacy comes from, or does he also have a multi-class background? So I'm a little more curious about what I'm interested in. Sorry if it deviates.
So let me understand this argument. So private sector, you're saying the rise of a huge private sector in India
Yeah, should have-
since 1991
Yeah.
should have what implication?
Should have, this sort of liberal theory, right, that it would tamper down our, strategic and Machiavellian assumptions to be more reflective of our sort of, class-based and sort of economy growing interests.
So you're saying that should incline
Because,
Indian political elite towards peace more?
Manmohan Singh, that was his, he was not leader in your, in your terms, as I, now I see it, but he was very good at selling, this kind of thing that, we can be trading partners, if not, if we not, resolve the conflict, we can make it like more like a, a liberal solution to this problem. So
The
kind of,
trade over GDP
Over
ratio
GDP.
of China
yeah, right.
has not helped, has not propelled Xi Jinping towards peace.
Right, but it's a state-oriented middle class, and that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, it's
It's not a private individual.
Yeah, but he's on the
That's-
right side of the
around just before his rise
Yeah.
to in 2012, trade over GDP had started declining, but about 2009,
Yeah.
trade over GDP in China is 65%.
No, that's
It
exactly,
was an
China is a
unbelievable number.
state-oriented economy.
It's gone down since
India
then.
is a private
But that
sector.
did not generate a very peaceful inclination. Anyway, this is to be discussed.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from anyone? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're talking a lot about how the consolidation of power can provide stability for the leader, and with that stability, he can sort of make concessions towards peace. But I'd like to ask how the efforts towards peace are affected when the consolidation of power can be harmful to the public. That is, in examples of tyranny or oppression of the public. If the consolidation of power creates unrest domestically between the people and the leader, how does that sort of affect the external peacemaking efforts?
Yeah, so this is another, you're adding significantly, and in a different way to what Tyler was saying, that consolidation of power and authority is a double-edged sword. It can go into Clary's direction, and it can go exactly the other way, right? And so you're now adding the domestic, how consolidation of power might provoke domestic unrest, and then what it does to the decision-making. Yeah. Any other, yes?
The one thing that I find always really curious, and this is looking more from the nuclear point of view, nuclear politics point of view, about like CBMs between India and Pakistan, and usually an argument that is made that, the time that has been the most ripe for any sort of CBMs between India and Pakistan, whether they have been right after a crisis. So, like, thinking about the 1988 agreement on the prohibition of attack on nuclear facilities, thinking about the prior notification of the military exercises, or even after Kargil, like, the Lahore Declaration and the MOU that was signed in 1999. So I'm just curious about the timing of why is it that right after a crisis are we able to get these CBMs signed? Because according to your theory, then wouldn't there be the lowest amount of strategic incentive and also the most amount of kind of opposition domestically, or veto players, or I don't know, other actors who want to kind of spoil it? So why does that timing happen for these CBMs? I'm just curious.
So, Chris, you pick and choose, really. I mean, you have, there's a very serious and extensive commentary that you provoked.
That's right, we'll be here till 5.
Yes. But this is
It'll be like
this
a
is- for an
Castro-like
organizer,
speech.
this is a treat, and this is a book that has generated this kind of conversation. I mean, it's a very serious conversation you provoked. So you pick and choose what you wish to reply to.
Thank you. First off, for all of the very thoughtful feedback. One takeaway, which I'll just re-highlight at the outset, is an insight I want to convey, which is simple, and in the title, which is the politics of peace are incredibly hard. They're in fact much harder in some ways than the politics of war. So that one point, if I leave you convinced of anything, it's that you have to have the situation right in both capitals, as well as both capitals have to want it, and they have to want it for long enough to actually negotiate something hard and execute something hard. And so every time we see like a peace deal between real rival states, it's like a little miracle, like an angel got their wings, and we should be like applaud that occurred, and how difficult it is to have got it across the finish line.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment? Would this therefore also apply to rivals historically in modern time, Britain and France, America and Soviet Union?
So the dissertation, which you mentioned, is this a substantial? The dissertation focused on the South Asia chapter was very short. It was 60 pages of the dissertation, and most of the dissertation focused on the U.S.-Soviet relationship, the Soviet-China relationship, and the U.S.-China relationship.
I see.
And
Thank you for converting 60 pages into 200 something.
and what I decided, I had a 160,000 word dissertation, and I said, well, what do I care about here? Don't do that, by the way, if you're a PhD student, don't do that. Then Tyler told me he got 150,000 words through Cambridge.
Yeah, lucky.
So maybe you can. So I said, okay, I can't. When you have 160,000 words, you need to go down to roughly 100. I think this is about 120. You know, you're not in a scalpel, you're in an axe territory, and I decided I wanted to preserve the South Asia pieces. The piece I my first visit to South Asia is in 2002, and I've gone back, you know, on average a little bit more than once a year for the last 20 years. So I really care about this, which I hope comes across. So I do think a lot about these other cases. How does it travel in other circumstances? I want it to be right in South Asia, but I also don't want it to be like wrong elsewhere. So I'll come back to that a little bit on some of the China examples that Tyler, I think, helpfully offered. We'll see. We'll do a little jazz and we'll see what comes out. So let me go and order the commentators. I won't do everything, but I'll just do things where I feel like my answer is better. And if they had a really good point, I'll just I'll pretend I forgot it. I am a little agnostic on what happened in partition. I have it in kind of a pre-chapter because I think it's like before the rivalry, right? The partition plus the First Kashmir War is why the rivalry exists. And I just want to say, it does. I agree. There's actually lots of leaders, but it's really messy on the Pakistan side. That's all my point is. I don't know. I think we still don't know for sure whether Jinnah knew. It's clear a lot of politicians knew. There's no doubt about that. From the Prime Minister, certainly the head of Northwest Frontier Province. I mean, there's no doubt that lots of Muslim League politicians knew, and lots of individuals in the Pakistan Army knew. But it's just a total mess, and it's hard to think of. There's not the deliberation that led to it. You can see, that Jinnah kind of in his final months is sort of, he's like, what a mess we made. Like, it's like there's a sense that it was handled very poorly, and I think it was handled poorly in part because it was such a messed up process. During a period of time of incredible fluidity, when all of Pakistan is like moving, like the leadership is literally moving around from place to place, and then it's spread apart geographically from Karachi to Pindi as they're making these decisions that end up setting them on a course to rivalry. You note that at points it's who I focus on as the leader. The one might quibble, but I guess my broader point is if it's not clear who the leader is, then that's probably a sign that you have fractured authority. So I don't care in a way whether we want to focus on whoever, but if there's a legitimate dispute, that's a great indicator that you're probably in a period of fractured
Can I just ask you a
authority.
question? So take the 65 war.
Yes.
Right? So we know that Ayub was not a fan of this, right? Theoretically, do we consider Ayub to be in charge? Because we know that Zulfikar was chomping at the bit. This was his baby, right? So in that rivalry, now I take your point that it's fractured, but is it really? Because Zulfikar is able to basically push his agenda over Ayub. So I struggle.
Is he that powerful by 1964-65? Zulfikar Ali Bhutto?
Well, so that's the
That he
question.
can push someone like Ayub?
Well,
Ayub was
Huh?
he was convinced though by the end.
so I'm not convinced that he was. I mean, I'm not convinced that he was. And you don't make a compelling case that he was in your book either.
I think there's a debate about what Ayub knew when.
Yeah.
I think that's like just unsettled in the historical record. That there's so we have a Ayub biased biographer, Altaf Gohar, right, who is saying that he doesn't believe Bhutto and Aziz Ahmed were briefing Ayub fully in the preparation phase, and then Ayub, for reasons that are still mysterious for history, actually leaves the capital
Yes.
when the plan is being launched.
Yes.
Now, maybe that's to have deniability. We don't know.
No.
It's one of these things lost to the record. But again, there's a debate about what then. So Bhutto goes to brief him. He flies over to brief him, and we don't know what's said. Right? It's just we don't have it.
But that would not. But this point that Chris is raising, Chris Fair is raising, you can easily accommodate. Like this is an example of fractured authority.
No, I love it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's completely
No, no.
fractured authority.
No,
That's what it is. If he's not even in the capital when this is being launched, and if Bhutto has become so powerful by
Yeah.
then that he has to accommodate him, etc. So this is fractured authority. Muhammad Ayub is not in control.
Correct. No, I'm agreeing with him.
Yeah.
It's an example of like,
Yeah.
of the ballast of control from, and when I read these guys, that's the tipping point for Zulfikar, because at this point, everything happens after 65, Zulfikar is the beneficiary, right? At Tashkent, the army's disgraced, Zulfikar rises at the UN, and then he runs off and he sets up the PPP.
Yeah, so it's funny. I don't think I have all of these quotes in there, but the British High Commissioner to Pakistan, Maurice James, at this time he likens it to Othello, and where Iago, right, convinces Othello to do this thing that ultimately destroys Othello, right? And he says these guys, Aziz Ahmed and Zulfikar, were Iago. They were convincing Ayub to ultimately bring down his own downfall in order that they could rise. Right. So now,
Well, he argues they knew it would fail.
I think that is certainly this implication of the memoir. Right. So it's a brief line in this broader memoir.
So long as you're on 65, I know I'm interrupting, but we are discussing 65. There's another important story there. Ram Guha has written about how Nehru sent Sheikh Abdullah to Pakistan
Yes.
to start a peace dialogue. Nehru sent Sheikh Abdullah to start talking to Ayub, and when Nehru dies on May 27, 1964, Sheikh Abdullah is in Pindi,
Yes.
and he starts crying, and he sends letters. I'm crying. I don't know what I can do now. We think we are on the verge of a breakthrough here. I've been here in Pakistan for 2 months or 3 months as a result of Prime Minister Nehru sending me here and exploring peace. And conversations had begun, and now Nehru's gone.
And in fact, Bhutto goes, I think, as the most senior Pakistani representative at Nehru's funeral. And my recollection, I'd have to go back, is that Zulfikar flies on the plane with Sheikh Abdullah back to Delhi.
I think you're right.
Quite possible.
And they talk about, in fact, how they're going to move Kashmir forward, but it all falls apart because Shastri says convincingly that he doesn't have any authority, really, that he's
Okay. Yes.
So-
no more interruptions. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. This is all good. This
Yeah.
is what I love. Another point I think that Christine makes, which is, the one challenge, which I should have mentioned when I talked about this like golden age of research. One, we don't have Pakistani records that are meaningful. This is the great sadness. We have some memoirs, and so what we have to do is triangulate to what the Pakistanis told the Indians, what they told the Americans, what they told the British. Sometimes we have some Canadian, Australian records, and that's the biggest bias. Is we have this very truncated set of information about Pakistan, and I think also it is an interrelated problem with Pakistan. Is even if we had unfettered access to the archives, a lot of it is not an archival culture for important national security decisions. So even if we could magically go into there, it's not clear many of these episodes we would have that. So that is the principal bias. On Indira Gandhi, I agree with 100%. I'm fascinated by 71. I wrote a piece on U.S. mistakes in 71, and I remember sending, it was for a special issue of Journal Strategic Studies that Rudy Chowdhury edited, and I said, Rudy, there's too much. Here's a 17,000 word draft. Can you just figure out what I should cut? He's like, Chris, this is not going to work. You got to cut it down yourself, buddy. So the U.S. view of Indira is quite biased, but actually in that case, I think Indira's own advisors, who are men, I should note, almost without exception.
No exception.
Yeah, I can't think of any. Yeah, so Haksar in particular, those are where I'm drawing more of my views of how I think the U.S. is also watching and I think validating what a lot of contemporary evidence is saying in terms of her ability to control politics there. But as I tried to piece together that 70s, the Jairam Ramesh Haksar biography, and especially that big need more editing, but it's still that's a big tome that was very helpful to me. the last piece I want to respond to of what Christine said, I'm sure there's other things that we can chat about, was how to think about the fact that one of the states here, Pakistan, and we could quibble about what India has done over the years, has had this strategy of using non-state actors, but that strategy is there's certainly no Pakistani records I can go to, right? There's no
The militant groups actually do document.
well, they
a
have maybe
lot of
some
what
chits,
they've
some
done.
stamped paper.
No, they actually have. I mean, they're just not in English. And that's the book that's coming out. It's like, what do these guys say about what they're doing?
So the
Which Chris has access to, right? That's-
yeah. So
Had.
so what I try to do in the book is talk about what we can infer about the incentives and how that might relate to this choice to dial up or down a strategy, with an understanding that there's some stochastic element that these attacks can succeed or fail in unpredictable ways. Like, let's take your point. Like, let's imagine, and I'm willing, in a way, it doesn't matter to me whether, in fact, it may be better if Musharraf had a strategic incentive to escalate in December 2001. If that car had got stopped at the gate, maybe only the attackers might have died, and no parliamentary staff. Or if they hadn't run into the vice president's car as they pulled into the compound, they might have blown up the whole Lok Sabha, and there would have been a war.
It is a jihadi blooper moment.
Yeah, I mean, so if you
What
look,
did you say, Jihadi?
Jihadi blooper, a blooper reel of the jihadis, because he literally, the jihadi car actually does hit the vehicle, and that's how the whole thing. They don't proceed further, and they just detonate right there.
it's like you have so much success, you manage to
Exactly.
get into this very secured compound,
And the dude
And then you-
backs up and hits the VP's car.
So I just try to say, well, it's very hard. We don't have any deliberative discussion. Nothing from the U.S. memoirs has. We don't have anything because we don't have declassified documents that period. We have a little bit associated with 9/11.
There is the WikiLeaks.
Well, WikiLeaks, sadly, I cannot go to.
Oh, right. Oh, I lost my clearance, so I can use it now.
Well, I also, but I believe my agreement requires me never to
okay.
mishandle classified information.
I see.
But other people should look at what WikiLeaks says on this period. But so I try to talk through as much as I can about what we might infer. On Khalistan, I looked a lot at what I could say about the level of support, including looking a lot at what the Indians were handing over to the Pakistanis. Now, the Indians aren't going to want to burn their own sources and methods, but I do think that's a good area. I'm delighted every time I hear of somebody working on Pakistani support to the Khalistan movement. Do it. I think this is a ripe area for research, and it's a big gap. And we have a lot of anecdata, but it is. I think more would be better, and I don't think it matters too much for the contours of that Zia case in terms of my argument. But I do think if I had more, I spent several days just like trying to look. I looked through all these CIA documents. Is there anything that's been released that I can say what was going on? And it was certainly thinner than I would desire. So anybody that can work on that area, I would love it.
Yeah.
A few additional points as I go through the rest of the commentators.
5 points. 5 minutes you have.
5 minutes. I will do it.
Yeah.
I will do it. Is the argument too materialist at its core? Maybe, but I think it's always good to have that, because if not, I just wind up with like an unfalsifiable mess. Once I can throw an ideational layer into there, I can really I can cook whatever I want to with that. Some ideas, throw that in there. So I just wanted to say, okay, let's try to, as well I can, describe what elite politics, how they were perceived, describe what I can say about strategic incentives. But I'm quite open to the point that ideational variables, be they ideological or others, can distort material strategic incentives in a really profound way. And I do certainly try to argue, what I want to argue in the book is that I find in the cases here, that happens more often when there are these fractures of authority, because there's these incentives to distort information that you send up the chain, which is contrary, I think, to some of the personalism literature. Another point I think that Asfandyar made that is good, and maybe is worth research by others, is are there sort of styles of peacemaking, or there's a book by Chris Toomey where he talks about theories of victory, but maybe there's do people have different theories of peace? A lot of leaders do have a theory of peace that involves symmetry, I would know. You know, there's not a lot of leaders that actually think peace is like quiet work in the back. You know, it's a lot of leaders think, I gotta have a big, grand tamasha or whatever, right? So, and that may matter, but I do think the material case for Indian restraint in 71 is more than, I have a piece I published in the Hindustan Times. India to keep pressing in the West would have been very hard. And what are you going to do? Just murder the prisoners of war in the East? It doesn't really matter once you capture them. So how do you achieve a greater strategic advantage? It's not clear to me. And India didn't want China to come in. I mean, I think there's a lot of materialist reasons in 71 for them not to push anymore and take what they could get, separate from Huxer's views primarily that you didn't want to cause another Hitler next door. I was talking to Tyler before this. I agree entirely about this idea that there's this other side of personalism that I'm trying to emphasize in the book. And it's not just, I think it doesn't have to be personalism in style. There are leaders that have institutional control over their systems that we wouldn't call personalist, that have the latitude to move. But I spent a lot of time, as I was writing the dissertation and the book, I've spent a lot of time thinking about Menachem Begin and Sadat, leaders that really just managed to get firm authority over their society, and how crucial that was for them to be able, especially Sadat, to make compromises that have led, to an enduring Egyptian-Israeli peace. And I've thought a lot about that in the Chinese case, and we can talk, and you can probably convince me because you know more about that case than I do. But I don't think it's an accident that Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, you can muddle through for a long time, but can you actually do anything to permanently transform relations if you have fractured authority? I don't know. I think it's not a surprise that you get Nixon and Mao, you get and Deng and Gorbachev. After Gorbachev goes through this period of time where he fires basically everybody that works in Asia that doesn't like China. Right? Gorbachev's entire last part of the 80s is firing people so that he can have authority over foreign policy. And I think we can also talk about the timeline of the 78 communique as it relates to, I think Deng by then had I would have to go back and look, but my recollection is Hua Guofeng is a pretty marginal figure.
78, Deng has risen, but I'm not sure he has...
December 78.
December 78, when he's
And
consolidated.
that's the start of the consolidation.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear he's got the PLA backing, and there's no real.
Okay.
But we can talk
The Gang of
offline.
Four is pretty much gone by then.
Well, that's 76, but yeah, that's a different, it's a different faction within the party.
Okay.
So
1 minute.
last point.
Yeah, 2 minutes, let's say, yeah.
So you raise, I think, an interesting point, which is when you have fractured authority, shouldn't the preferences of the alternative centers of power kind of affect the prediction we're going to make for the relationship? Because you can have all sorts of reasons. And what I want to try to show in the book is lots of different alternative power centers, when they have enough power to mess with things, opportunistically choose to mess with things, even if it's contrary to what we might think their ideological preferences are. So Sonia Gandhi, obviously this Italian woman, is not ideologically predisposed to hate Pakistan, but she opportunistically said, hey, there's an opportunity here I don't want to let go. Benazir Bhutto, after the Indians seized the Siachen Glacier in '84, she is from this family with a ideological disposition against India, but she beats up on Zia in the sort of rump National Assembly that Zia is allowed to be reconstituted by the end of the 80s. And it's like, you're treasonous Pakistan Army, you let the Indians come in here and seize Siachen from us. Because it's rivalry is a cudgel that you can use against your domestic political opponents, and it's very rare for domestic political opponents to leave that be. And Imran Khan it seems quite clear to me, and felt that there was this something with him and Bajwa where he couldn't allow normalization, or certainly did not want to be exposed to the chance that maybe the army could change its mind. But the partnership between Bajwa and Khan fell apart for many reasons. But I believe, when the history is written, part of the reason it fell apart was because talks with India were getting serious, and Imran Khan sensed political opportunity to mess with that, and also risk with not messing with it. And that's part of why those two power centers fell apart, because, it's something that happened earlier. The quote that was in an earlier draft, I think, left, but it's very hard to have a true duumvirate when there are two power centers, even if they are closely aligned. Something will come along and they'll find a reason to beat each other up, and that has been a story in Pakistan often. So thank you all for your rich feedback,
Well,
and
it's
the audience as well.
Time to thank the panel for a truly, truly stimulating afternoon. Thank you. And Chris for providing the stimulant.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, guys.
And, there is a small reception outside before we disappear for the evening. Please join us there.
What's your next book going to be on?